They watched when a quiet veteran and his German shepherd drove past the last gas station and kept going toward the wind-cut mountain. They shook their heads when he stopped on a frozen slope where trees leaned like they were trying to escape. And they laughed when he didn't build a normal cabin at all. Just a low, curved shelter pressed into rock, more like the earth had folded over itself than a house. Why would a man who'd already lost so much choose the coldest place to start over? Why did his dog stand guard over one exact patch of ground, as if something invisible was written there? And why, when the sky turned heavy and the storm came without warning, did the place everyone mocked become the one spot the wind couldn't break? Tonight's story isn't only about surviving a blizzard, it's about listening to the land, to hard-earned lessons, and to a loyal dog who sensed the danger long before anyone else did. Stay with us. Wind slid over the Wyoming prairie like a blade drawn slowly across stone, carrying the dry whisper of snow not yet fallen, and the long, hollow voice of the upper ridges waiting for winter to claim them. Hollis Cade drove without music, without the radio chatter of weather warnings, without anything that might compete with the sound of the engine and the wind pushing against the truck's aging frame. At 55, he moved with the contained stiffness of a man who had once been powerful without thinking about it, and now measured every motion like a negotiation. He was tall, still solid through the chest and shoulders, but there was a permanent bend in his posture, not weakness, more like a tree that had grown for decades in a steady prevailing wind. His hair, once dark brown, had surrendered at the temples to silver that caught the pale afternoon light, and a short, uneven beard framed a face carved by sun, dust, and the quiet erosion of years lived in places where sleep never fully arrived. A pale scar cut through his right eyebrow, thin as a thread of chalk, and his right knee, braced beneath worn denim, pulsed with a familiar cold ache that arrived before every storm front, as reliable as any forecast. Beside him on the cracked vinyl seat lay Rook, a 7-year-old German shepherd whose black saddle and rich tan coat looked almost burnished against the gray interior. Rook's muzzle showed only the faintest dusting of lighter fur, but his amber eyes carried the steady, alert focus of a working dog, who had long ago learned that rest was only a pause between decisions. One paw rested lightly against Hollis's thigh, not for comfort, but for contact, the quiet reassurance of presence that had followed them from another life neither of them spoke about anymore. Briar's End appeared gradually, not so much a town as a widening in the road where buildings had chosen to gather against the wind rather than challenge it. The gas station sat at the edge, a low structure with peeling white paint and a sign that flickered between letters as if unsure whether it still believed in itself. 2 pickup trucks were parked outside, both dusted with old salt and new frost. A man leaned against the pump, arms folded over a heavy canvas jacket. He was in his early 40s, thick through the middle in the way of someone who had done hard labor long enough to stop pretending it was temporary. His beard was the color of dry straw, cut short but uneven, and his eyes had the narrowed, habitual squint of a man used to judging distance across open land. His name, though Hollis did not yet know it, was Colter Boone. Colter was known in town as someone dependable in a storm and difficult in a disagreement, shaped by years of drought seasons that had taken more from his family ranch than they had given back. Beside him stood a younger man, maybe 20, all angles and restless motion, brown hair falling into his eyes as he shifted his weight from heel to heel. He wore a hoodie under his jacket despite the cold, hands shoved deep in the pockets as if he had not yet decided whether he belonged in the world of older men and older weather. His name was Eli Mercer, recently back from a year working oil fields in North Dakota, carrying the brittle impatience of someone who had left home to become someone else and returned to find the town unchanged. As Hollis's truck rolled past, both men looked up. Rook's head lifted instantly, ears forward, gaze steady but not hostile. Coulter let out a short breath through his nose. "That the guy?" Eli asked, voice pitched low but not low enough. Coulter nodded once. "Heard he's taking that upper parcel, wind shelf." Eli huffed a laugh. "Nobody stays up there." Coulter didn't laugh. He just watched the truck continue, eyes following until the rear lights disappeared around the bend toward the mountain road. "Some folks don't come here to stay," he said quietly, more to himself than to Eli. Hollis didn't stop. He felt the weight of their eyes, the way he felt the change in air pressure before a front rolled through. Not personal, just part of the landscape. Towns like Briar's End had learned to measure strangers the way they measured snowfall, how much would fall, how long it would last, and what damage it might do before it melted. He didn't blame them. He had once measured men the same way, though under a different sky. His hands stayed loose on the steering wheel, knuckles scarred and broad, nails cut short with the absent-minded precision of habit. The road began to climb, pavement giving way to packed dirt, glazed with a thin sheen of ice that caught the light like dull glass. He shifted carefully, easing the truck upward, feeling the subtle tremor in the wheel that told him where the ground ended and the slope began, to decide things on its own. Rook shifted his weight with the incline, claws clicking softly against the seat as he adjusted, eyes fixed not on the road, but on the line of the ridge above, as if reading something written in rock and wind that Hollis could only guess at. The parcel lay beyond a stand of wind-leaning pines, whose trunks twisted slightly in the same direction, all of them shaped by years of the same invisible force. Hollis parked near a natural break in the trees, where rock outcroppings rose from the ground like old shoulders. When he stepped out, the air hit his face with clean, biting clarity, carrying the dry scent of stone and distant snowfields. He paused, letting his knee settle before putting full weight on it, breathing in slowly. There was space here, not emptiness. He had learned the difference, but space, the kind that did not press on the back of his thoughts. Rook jumped down lightly, landing with controlled precision, immediately circling once before stopping near a broad slab of granite that jutted from the ground at an angle. His tail held level, not wagging, just steady. He sniffed, then stood there, ears pricked toward the upper slope where the wind moved differently, folding and unfolding around the terrain. Hollis watched him, a faint crease forming between his brows. "You like this spot," he murmured, voice low, almost conversational. Rook didn't look back. Hollis walked the edge of the clearing, boots crunching over frozen grass and scattered gravel. He noted the way the ground dipped slightly near the rock, the way the trees behind it formed a partial barrier without closing off the view downhill. He imagined walls not yet there, weight low, shape close to the earth. His mind did not leap ahead to roofs or doors. It stayed with angles, wind paths, the memory of structures that had held under pressure because they did not resist in straight lines. He did not think of it as building a home, not yet. Home was a word that carried expectations, and expectations were heavier than stone. This was something else, an answer to a question he did not phrase out loud. Behind him, the wind shifted, and Rook turned his head sharply toward the higher ridge, body going still in that particular way Hollis recognized from long ago. Not fear, not aggression, but attention sharpened to a point. Hollis followed the dog's gaze. The sky there had deepened by a shade, the light thinning as afternoon edged toward evening sooner than the clock suggested. He felt it then, not with his skin, but somewhere deeper, a familiar tightening, the sense that the land was not hostile, just honest about what it would demand. He exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to carry more years than air, and looked back at the granite slab where Rook waited. "All right," he said quietly. "We start here." Rook's tail moved once, a small, deliberate sweep, as if a decision had been confirmed. Hollis did not yet see the town below, watching the ridge, did not hear the stories already forming in low voices over coffee and fuel pumps. In this moment, there was only wind, rock, a man who had come to the edge of things, and a dog who had already chosen where they would stand. Morning came pale and metallic, light reflecting off frost like thin sheets of broken glass scattered across the slope. Hollis Cade stood with his boots planted in frozen soil, breath rolling from his mouth in slow clouds as he studied the ground Rook had chosen the day before. At 55, he no longer trusted instinct alone. He confirmed it with angles, wind memory, the way snow gathered in corners of land others never noticed. He drove the first stake into the earth with a short-handled sledge, the sound dull, absorbed rather than echoed, and that told him more than sight ever could. This ground held weight. Rook stood nearby, 7 years old, but moving with the alert discipline of a dog still on duty. Black saddle stark against the pale morning. His ears tilted constantly, not toward sounds Hollis could hear, but toward patterns in air that belonged to pressure, not noise. Hollis marked the arc of the foundation, not a full circle, but a half-moon pressed into the rock face, the open curve facing slightly southeast, away from the worst winter winds that tore down from the northern pass. The design looked wrong to the untrained eye, incomplete, like something abandoned before being finished. That was the point. Structures that tried to be complete against nature often failed first. By midday, the sun hovered behind a film of high cloud, turning the world into a place without sharp shadows. Hollis worked steadily, not fast, not slow, each stone chosen for fit rather than size. His right knee pulsed with its familiar deep ache, but pain had long ago become background noise, like wind under a door. He crouched carefully, setting the base stones lower on the windward side, building the arc tighter where force would press hardest. Rook made slow circuits, nose low, occasionally stopping at a specific gap and touching it with his muzzle before looking back at Hollis. Silent, but precise. Hollis adjusted without comment. Their partnership did not require explanation. It operated in the space between observation and action. The first visitor arrived just after the sun began its shallow descent. A pickup rattled up the track, engine loud in the stillness. The driver stepped out with the stiff, wide stance of someone whose hips had known too many hours in a saddle or tractor seat. He was in his late 50s, tall and rope-lean, with a face tanned into permanent lines and a gray mustache trimmed carefully, as though small control over appearance mattered when the land offered none. His name was Wendell Pike, a rancher whose family had lost half their herd 3 winters ago, when an early storm froze the creek before they could move the cattle. Since then, Wendell's humor had thinned, replaced by a bluntness people mistook for cruelty. He approached, hands on hips, eyes sweeping the half-moon trench. "You plannin' to live in a ditch, Cade?" he called, voice dry as last year's grass. Hollis straightened slowly. "Plannin' to stay warm," he replied. Wendell snorted, but his gaze lingered on the way the ark hugged the stone outcrop. "Wind comes crosswise here," he said after a moment, not quite advice, not quite warning. Hollis nodded once. "I know." Wendell studied him, then Rook. The dog met his stare without challenge, tail level, body still. "That dog yours?" Wendell said. "He ain't relaxed." "He doesn't relax," Hollis answered. Wendell grunted. "Good luck, then," he muttered, and left, tires crunching frost like brittle bones. Late afternoon bled into a grayish blue, the kind of light that erased distance. Hollis had raised the first course of stone knee-high when Rook froze mid-step, head snapping toward the ridge above. His posture changed. Not alarm, not aggression, but calculation. Hollis followed his line of sight. Nothing moved. No animal, no drifting branch. Only sky, heavy and smooth. Then he felt it, the air thickening, pressure settling low in his chest like an unasked question. Rook trotted to the north end of the ark and pawed at a section Hollis had considered secure. He dug once, twice, then looked back sharply. Hollis sighed, lowered himself with care, and pulled the stones apart, adding 2 flatter rocks beneath to change the angle of force. As soon as he finished, Rook moved on, repeating the process 2 feet down the line. It went on like that for nearly an hour, dog indicating, man adjusting, until the structure felt less like something being built and more like something being tuned. Twilight brought the second interruption. This time it was not a truck, but a figure on foot, emerging between the pines with the careful step of someone who knew the slope well. She was in her early 30s, medium height, wrapped in a faded red parka patched at both elbows. Her dark hair was braided over one shoulder, strands escaping to whip across a face browned by sun rather than cold. Her name was Lisa Moreno, a seasonal surveyor who mapped fence lines and water access for the county. A year ago, she had been stranded overnight in a sudden whiteout when her ATV stalled. She had walked 6 miles in drifting snow to reach a highway, and since then she moved through winter landscapes with an almost reverent caution. She stopped a few yards away, studying the half-moon shape. "That's not a cabin," she said. "No," Hollis replied. She nodded slowly. "Smart," she murmured, surprising him. "Snow loads slide off lower curves, less sheer." Hollis gave her a brief glance, reassessing. "You've built?" She shook her head. "Just survived bad builds." Her eyes shifted to Rook. "He picked the rock, didn't he?" Hollis didn't answer. He didn't need to. Lisa watched the dog for a long moment, then looked back at the sky. "Pressure's dropping faster than forecast," she said quietly. "If you're working after dark, keep the wind at your back." She left as she'd come, footsteps swallowed by frost. Night settled not with darkness, but with a dimming, as if the world had been wrapped in wool. Snow began as a fine drift, barely visible, turning the air into a slow-moving curtain. Hollis covered his tools, securing them low against the rock. He spread a tarp across the unfinished ark, not to keep snow out, but to watch how the wind treated it. Rook refused the truck, choosing instead to lie just inside the curve, body aligned with the open side as though bracing against something unseen. Several times through the night he rose, padded along the wall, and nudged specific stones, prompting Hollis to crawl out and pack earth tighter between them. Each time he returned to the truck, Hollis lay awake, not from cold, but from the steady awareness that they were not alone with the weather. Something about the ridge felt watchful, not hostile, simply attentive. Around midnight, the wind shifted direction without warning, sweeping down the slope from the east instead of the north. The tarp fluttered, but did not tear. The curve redirected the gust, guiding it along the stone like water around a hull. Hollis sat up, heart steady, and watched Rook through the windshield. The dog's silhouette remained still, head raised, ears forward, a sentinel in falling white. Hollis felt then a quiet understanding that came not as relief, but as confirmation. This structure, strange and unfinished, was already behaving like shelter. Not because of walls or roof, but because of the way it listened to the land rather than argued with it. He leaned back, eyes closing briefly, and let the rhythm of wind over curve replace the old rhythm of distant artillery that still sometimes haunted his sleep. Outside, snow continued to fall, patient, testing, and the house that wasn't a house held its shape against the first true conversation with winter. By the third day, the sky lowered into a strange blue-gray density, as if the mountain had drawn a long breath and refused to release it. Hollis Cade felt it in his knee before he saw it in the clouds. The ache sharpened from background murmur to pointed pressure, the kind that once meant incoming artillery or weather turning hostile. He stood outside the half-moon foundation, shoulders bent into the wind, breath tight in his chest, not from fear, but recognition. The air didn't feel cold. It felt heavy, like the space before a door burst open. Rook, 7 years old, and built like a soldier who had never stopped being on duty, had already begun. The German shepherd dug sharply at the north end of the wall, claws scattering frozen soil in quick bursts. His ears were high, tail rigid, amber eyes flicking not toward the horizon, but toward empty air. He barked once, short and clipped, not alarm, command. Hollis moved without argument. He lowered himself carefully, ignoring the protest of his knee, and packed more earth along the base, reinforcing the arc where wind pressure would concentrate if it shifted cross-slope. Rook shifted 2 feet left, scratched again. Hollis followed. They worked like that for nearly an hour, the rhythm familiar, precise, wordless. The light drained early. By late afternoon, the sun was only a pale suggestion behind thickening cloud, turning the world the color of cold metal. The pines above the clearing stopped whispering and began to hold still, their needles angled downward like waiting spears. That silence unsettled Hollis more than noise ever had. Wind you could brace against. Stillness meant calculation. He tied the tarp lower, anchoring its edges under stone instead of over it, leaving no loose flap to catch a gust. Rook paced the perimeter, nose lifted now, sampling the air in slow pulls. Hollis watched the dog's breathing, faster than rest, slower than stress, alert, measuring. The first snow came without ceremony, a dry curtain drifting sideways rather than falling, dusting the stones but not yet settling. Darkness arrived like a dropped lid. One moment the ridge was gray, the next it was black and moving. Wind tore across the slope in a long, rising howl that vibrated through Hollis's chest more than his ears. Snow thickened instantly, swirling in dense spirals that erased the tree line 10 yards out. He retreated into the truck for only a moment to grab the lantern and his heavier gloves. When he stepped back toward the structure, Rook stood inside the arc, body angled into the open curve as if shielding something that was not yet there. Hollis knelt beside him, lighting the lantern low and setting it behind the inner wall so the flame wouldn't attract the wind's pull. The half-moon began to show its purpose. Gusts that should have slammed straight into them slid along the curve, breaking and reforming behind the rock face. The air inside the arc moved differently, still violent, but less direct, like waves hitting a harbor wall instead of open shore. The storm did not build gradually. It struck in layers, a blast from the north, then another from the east, cross-currents colliding above the ridge. Hollis felt the structure flex, not physically, but in the way the tarp trembled and settled, the stones humming faintly under pressure. Rook lay flat, chin down, ears forward, eyes half-lidded in that deep-focused stare Hollis had seen in the worst moments overseas. He remembered nights when mortars had landed beyond vision, the dog already alert seconds before impact. That same tension lived in Rook now, but directed at sky and air instead of men. Then came the light, a dim, erratic glow low on the mountain road, wavering through the snow like a dying star. Hollis stood, lantern in one hand, scanning the slope. The glow dipped, vanished, then reappeared lower, angled wrong. Headlights, not steady, sliding. Rook sprang to his feet, a single bark snapping into the wind. Hollis left the shelter's curve and moved downhill, boots sinking deep, each step a fight against the sideways push of air. The light lurched once more and went dark with a metallic thud that even the storm could not swallow. He found the truck half off the track, rear wheels buried, front angled toward a shallow drop. The driver's door opened against the wind with effort. A woman stepped out, maybe 30, medium height but narrow through the shoulders, bundled in a pale blue winter coat already crusted with ice. Her dark hair, pulled into a low knot, had broken loose, strands frozen to her cheeks. Her name, she gasped between breaths, was Mira Halden. She had the strained, controlled tone of someone used to holding panic back for the sake of others. A year earlier, she had lost her husband to a highway pileup during a spring storm. Since then, weather had become something she negotiated with rather than trusted. Behind her, 2 children emerged from the passenger side. A boy around 10, with a sharp, watchful gaze and wind-reddened skin, and a younger girl, perhaps 7, small and pale, her knitted hat pulled low over wide eyes that tracked Hollis like he was part of the storm itself. The boy's name was Theo, protective in the way of children forced to grow faster than they should. The girl was Leanie, quiet, clutching a threadbare stuffed rabbit under one arm, its fur stiff with ice. "We can't stay in the truck," Mira shouted over the wind. "It's dying." Hollis nodded once. "Follow me." She looked past him toward the ridge, confusion and disbelief flickering across her face. "There's nothing up there." Hollis turned, pointing to the low, dark shape pressed against the rock. "There is tonight." Rook was already moving, circling back, barking once to guide them. Theo grabbed Leanie's hand. Mira kept one hand on each child's shoulder as they stumbled upward. Snow lashed their faces, the wind trying to spin them sideways, but the moment they crossed into the ark's lee, the force shifted. It did not stop, but it bent. The difference was enough. Inside the half-moon, Hollis spread an extra tarp along the open side, angling it to deflect direct gusts while leaving space for air to pass. He set the lantern low and shielded, then struck flint to coax a small fire from the kindling he had kept dry beneath the truck seat. Flame took slowly, reluctantly, then steadied, its glow pooling against the stones. Mira sank to her knees beside the children, wrapping her arms around them. Theo tried to sit upright, jaw set, but his shoulders trembled uncontrollably. Leanie leaned into Rook without hesitation, and the dog settled against her, warmth radiating through thick fur. Mira looked around, disbelief softening into something like awe. "How is it quieter in here?" she whispered. Hollis adjusted a stone at the base of the tarp. "It's not quiet," he said. "It's redirected." Outside, the storm roared on, unseen but relentless. Snow hammered the tarp in bursts, then slid along the curve, spilling past instead of piling. Hollis watched the fire's reflection flicker in Rook's eyes. The dog was no longer pacing. He was listening. Mira followed his gaze, then looked at Hollis. "You built this?" He shook his head slightly. "I listened." She didn't understand the full meaning, but she nodded anyway, as if part of her did. Theo edged closer to the fire, studying the stones as though memorizing their shape. Leanie fell asleep against Rook's side, breath evening out. Hollis sat with his back to the rock face, feeling the structure hold, feeling the wind move around them like water forced to change course. He did not think of himself as rescuer or builder or even host. Only a man who had once learned that survival was not about standing strongest in the open, but about finding the shape that let force pass by. And in the strange, humming heart of the storm, the house that wasn't a house did exactly that. Inside the half-moon shelter, warmth did not rise. It settled low, pooled between stone and earth like breath cupped in two hands. And in that shallow basin of heat, the storm outside felt distant, almost theoretical, as if rage had been persuaded to circle rather than strike. The fire in the shallow pit burned small but steady, its orange glow licking the undersides of stones that had already learned to hold warmth. Smoke threaded upward through the narrow vent Hollis had cut along the tarp's upper seam, slipping out in a thin, disciplined stream, instead of choking the space. The curved roofline, low, sloped, pressed close to the ground, guided the wind along its back, forcing it to slide, not slam. Hollis Cade sat with his back against the granite outcrop, shoulders still broad despite the quiet bend of years. Silver at his temples, catching the lantern light, the pale scar through his right eyebrow, faint but visible when the fire brightened. His right knee throbbed in time with the storm's deeper pulses, but he ignored it the way he ignored old memories, acknowledged, not obeyed. Rook lay pressed along Lennie's side, the German shepherd's thick black and tan coat acting as a living blanket. Theo sat upright, jaw tight, trying to watch everything at once, while Mira Halden held both children close, her narrow shoulders trembling less now that heat had found them. Outside, the wind did not lessen. It only changed tone, rising and falling like breath through a cracked door. The first knock came as a shape in the sound, a rhythm that did not belong to wind. Rook's head lifted instantly, ears forward, body still but ready. Hollis didn't stand fast. He listened first. 3 knocks, uneven, then a pause. Human. He moved to the tarp's edge and lifted it just enough to look. Snow streamed sideways, and through it staggered an older man bent nearly double under the weight of the storm. He wore a long brown coat, gone dark with wet, collar turned up, a wool cap pulled low over white hair. His beard was thin and wispy, the kind that never grew full, and his face, lined, wind-burned, carried the stubborn set of someone who had lived more winters than he could count. His name was Harris Moen, 72, a widower who still insisted on tending his small orchard on the valley edge, even after a fall from a ladder 3 years ago had left him with a permanent stiffness in his left hip. Pride had kept him from asking neighbors for help. Tonight, pride had walked him into a blizzard. Hollis pulled him inside without ceremony. Harris blinked at the warmth, eyes watering, not from cold now, but from relief he didn't know how to express. "Didn't think this ridge had a heart," he muttered, settling near the wall, hands extended toward the fire. The second arrival was louder, a shout torn apart by wind. Rook barked once, sharp, guiding Hollis to the opening again. A couple pushed through the white, broad figures leaning into each other. The man was in his mid-40s, thick through the chest and arms from years of hauling feed sacks and fence posts, beard dark and heavy along a square jaw. His name was Dale Rusk, a farmer whose fields along the river flats had flooded every spring for the past decade, leaving him with the grim patience of someone who rebuilt the same fence year after year. Beside him was his wife, Corinne Rusk, shorter, solid, with a round face flushed raw by cold and strands of auburn hair plastered against her cheeks. Corinne's eyes were sharp, practical. She had once worked as an EMT in a town 2 counties over before moving here for Dale, and the reflex to assess injuries never left her. "We followed tire tracks till they vanished," Dale said between breaths. Corinne's gaze swept the shelter quickly, noting positions, heat source, smoke path. "This'll hold," she said almost to herself, and moved to help Mira adjust the children's blankets. Then came the third knock, firmer, deliberate. Hollis already knew who it would be before he lifted the tarp. Sheriff Boone Carver stepped through the storm, hat gone, dark hair plastered to his forehead, gray stubble shadowing a face usually set in authority. He was in his late 50s, tall and square-shouldered, but the cold had reduced him to a man first, badge second. Months ago, he had warned Hollis not to cause trouble on the ridge. Carver had a history of caution bordering on suspicion, shaped by an incident 15 years earlier when a poorly anchored hunting cabin collapsed in a winter storm, killing 2 teenagers. Since then, he trusted rules more than people. Now his eyes took in the low curve, the gathered bodies, the calm at the center of chaos. He said nothing about warnings. He just stepped in and let the tarp fall behind him. The shelter tightened with bodies, but not with panic. Hollis fed another piece of wood into the fire, watching how the flame strengthened but did not smoke. Harris shifted closer to Dale, the old man's thin shoulder leaning into the farmer's bulk. Corinne passed a thermos from her pack, sharing lukewarm coffee that tasted like rescue. Theo studied Sheriff Carver with wary curiosity. Leanie slept on, cheek pressed into Rook's fur, Outside, the storm struck in waves, and once a deep rumble rolled through the ground, a slope somewhere shedding snow, not near, but not far. The shelter hummed, stones absorbing vibration, releasing it slowly. Carver crouched opposite Hollis, hands extended toward the fire. "Road's gone below the switchback," he said, voice rough. "Drift higher than the hood." Hollis nodded once. He didn't ask how many others might be out there. The question had no answer tonight. Mira looked up, fear flickering, but Corin squeezed her shoulder gently. "We're here," she said. It wasn't reassurance of safety, only of presence. Rook stood suddenly, not barking, just turning his head toward the ridge again. Everyone froze, listening. Wind, yes, but beneath it, another faint sound. Wood cracking under weight, somewhere beyond sight. The message passed through the group without words. Stay. Low. Together. Hollis felt the weight of their eyes, waiting for instruction he never meant to give. He simply said, "Sit close. Share heat." They did. Bodies angled inward, knees nearly touching. The fire's glow reflected off faces lined by different lives, but drawn into the same circle. Time lost edges. Minutes stretched, then folded. At some point, Harris began to speak softly about his orchard, about apples that tasted sweeter after frost. Dale added a story about a calf born during a snow squall. Mira listened, children breathing evenly beside her. Carver watched Hollis across the fire, something like respect, quiet, reluctant, taking shape where judgment once stood. The storm did not ease, but the shelter did not falter. Wind flowed over the curve, split and rejoined behind them. Snow piled in drifts beyond the arc, but left the entrance mostly clear, sculpted by forces redirected rather than resisted. Hollis leaned back against the stone, eyes half closed, not sleeping, but resting in a way he hadn't in years. Not because danger had gone, but because it had been given a path to move past them. Around him, strangers breathed the same warm air, sharing the same small fire, and in the unspoken space between them lay a simple truth. Survival had nothing to do with who had been right before the storm. It belonged only to those who chose to stay close when the wind rose. Morning did not break. It revealed, light spilling across new snow, so bright the mountains looked plated in silver. Every ridgeline sharpened, every shadow, blue and deep like ink poured into carved stone. Hollis Cade stepped out from the low curve of the shelter and felt the silence first. Not the uneasy stillness from before the storm, but the kind that follows a long argument when both sides have finally said everything they can. The air was clean, knife cold, carrying the faint mineral scent of fractured ice. He stood tall, despite the habitual bend in his shoulders, silver threading his temples, the pale scar through his brow catching sunlight. Behind him, the half-moon structure remained as it had been through the night. Stones settled tight, tarp crusted in frost but intact, the arc pressed into rock as though it had grown there. Rook stepped out beside him, thick black and tan coat dusted white, amber eyes scanning the slope. The dog moved slowly, not with exhaustion, but with evaluation, nose sampling the morning air. Below, Briar's End did not look the same. Hollis could see the valley through the thinning haze, roofs bowed, smoke rising from places it shouldn't, the geometry of straight lines interrupted by drifts that had swallowed fences and doors. Sheriff Boone Carver came up behind him, coat open, hat back on his head but tilted, as if even he did not yet believe the storm had passed. His gray stubbled jaw worked once before he spoke. "3 roofs down near the river bend," he said quietly. "Barn collapsed on Pike's east pasture." Hollis nodded, absorbing the information without reaction. He had learned long ago that damage spoke for itself. Behind them, Mira Halden emerged with Theo and Leanie. Mira's dark hair, now dry and tied back, framed a face still drawn but steadier, grief and fear replaced by a fragile clarity. Theo stepped carefully, studying the snowpack like a surveyor twice his age, while Leanie held Rook's fur in one hand as if he were a fixed point in a shifting world. Harris Moen hobbled out next, leaning on a branch Hollis had cut into a makeshift cane. Dale and Corin Rusk followed, Dale scanning the horizon for landmarks, Corin already counting supplies under her breath. They stood together on the slope, all of them facing the town below. No one spoke for a long moment. Then movement appeared on the lower track, figures climbing. Wendell Pike led them, gray mustache stiff with frost, coat open despite the cold, as if he had forgotten to fasten it in his hurry. Behind him came Lisa Moreno, red parka bright against the snow, braid over her shoulder, steps sure even on ice. 2 younger men followed, carrying planks over their shoulders, and behind them more shapes, spreading out along the path like a line of ants rebuilding after a flood. When they reached the clearing, Wendell didn't waste breath. He looked at the shelter, at the way the drift curved around it instead of burying it, and nodded once, slow. "You are right," he said, not to Hollis alone, but to the shape of the structure itself. Lisa stepped forward, boots crunching. "Show us the angles," she said simply. Hollis didn't answer at first. He looked at Rook. The German shepherd stood between the old ark and the newcomers, tail level, head high, eyes moving from face to face as if measuring intent. Then the dog stepped aside, not submissive, not yielding, inviting. Hollis drew a breath that carried more weight than the cold and knelt in the snow, tracing the curve of the foundation with his gloved hand. "Low profile," he said. "Wind can't grab what it can't reach. Press it to stone if you can. Let the force pass. Don't block it." He spoke quietly, but they all leaned in. Even Carver crouched, badge catching light. Lisa nodded, repeating the angles under her breath, already translating them to other slopes in her mind. Work began without command. Wendell organized the younger men, voice rough but efficient. Dale and Corin unpacked tools from their truck, salvaged from what had survived the night. Harris sorted smaller stones, his thin hands steady despite the tremor of age. Mira helped Theo stack flat rocks, teaching him how to test balance before letting go. Leanie sat near Rook, passing pebbles to Harris as if it were a game. The shelter that had been one man's quiet defiance became a pattern in the snow. Another arc marked, then another. By midday the slope echoed with the sound of work, stone on stone, wood driven into frozen ground, breath and laughter rising in small bursts. No one spoke about the mocking words from days before. The storm had erased those as thoroughly as it had erased tire tracks. Sheriff Carver stood beside Hollis for a moment, watching the line of new foundations take shape. "We built straight because it was easier," he said. "Didn't mean it was stronger." Hollis gave a slight nod. "Straits for roads," he replied, "not for weather." Carver huffed a quiet laugh, the sound unfamiliar on his usually guarded face. As the sun lowered, light turned gold against the snow, shadows lengthening behind the new curves rising from the slope. Rook moved among the workers, pausing beside each foundation, nose low, sometimes sitting at a spot until someone adjusted a stone without fully knowing why. Lisa noticed. "He's mapping air," she murmured to Mira. Mira watched the dog with new understanding. "He kept my kids alive last night," she said softly. Lisa nodded once. "Then we listened to him too." When the first of the new shelters reached knee height, Wendell wiped his hands on his coat and looked at Hollis. "We'll build more," he said. Not a question, a plan. Hollis stood, feeling the ache in his knee like a distant echo, and looked over the slope. People bent to work, children learning balance from stone, the old and the young sharing the same arc of purpose. For the first time in years, the space inside his chest felt less like something he was carrying alone, and more like something open, connected. He did not smile widely, that wasn't his way, but the tightness behind his eyes eased. The hidden message moved through the work without words. Survival was not a contest of who endured alone, but a design of how many could endure together. The mountain had not punished them. It had simply demanded a different shape. As the light faded and the cold returned with evening, small fires began to glow inside the first completed curves, smoke rising straight into a sky finally calm. Hollis stood beside Rook, watching the slope transform. No longer a place he had come to hide, but one he now helped hold. Strength doesn't always look like standing tall against the wind. Sometimes, real strength is knowing how to bend, how to lower yourself close to the ground, and how to build in a shape that protects more than just you. Hollis didn't defeat the storm by fighting it. He survived by listening to the land, to experience, and to a loyal dog who sensed danger before it had a name. And when others came, cold and afraid, what saved them wasn't pride, walls, or who had been right before. It was closeness, shared warmth, and the choice to make space for someone else inside the shelter. In our daily lives, storms don't always arrive as snow and wind. Sometimes they come as illness, loss, loneliness, failure, or days when the weight of the world feels heavier than we can carry. We can try to stand alone, proving how strong we are. Or we can build differently. We can check on a neighbor, call a friend, forgive an old hurt, or open a small space in our lives where someone else can be safe. The strongest homes, like the strongest hearts, are shaped to hold others. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who might be going through their own storm. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Your voice matters here. Subscribe to the channel to stay with us for more stories of courage, loyalty, and hope. And may God watch over you, protect your home, and keep you warm, no matter what weather life brings your way.